Welcome back to By Sword and Musket, our channel where we look at antique and interesting objects. Now, this is exactly the kind of thing that I've been looking for a long time, and it ironically turned out to be the last gun in the shipment which needed any attention. Basically, I would normally clean it up. In a strange mix-up of chronology, I ended up doing a write-up first on this, and then it was as I was doing that and looking so closely that I discovered something rather unusual. To all intents and purposes, what we have here is a standard Imperial German Mauser. This is one of the later versions, which is a repeater. It's called the IG 7184. That means infantry Gewehr, which literally means infantry rifle. 7184. 71 was when the original single shot rifles were brought into service. 84 is when an adaptation was approved which made them into a repeater. The adaptation was the addition of a tubular magazine along the full length of the stock. In fact, a deepening of the casting and the machining that made up the receiver to enable a mechanical lifter to bring the next bullet up and push it into position. Let's not go into total depth over these rifles, but needless to say, being German, being Imperial German, it has a serial number. It also has maker's marks and royal crowns and ownership marks. So what we look for are matching numbers. And this rifle has matching numbers over absolutely everything bar two components. The first component is this front barrel band. This band, which incorporates the bayonet stud, is a replacement, field replacement or an armory replacement, because it is number 37. Even though it has a central pin that locks it into place. So there we are, 37, where it should say 94. But what's crazy is that this cross pin has got 94 on it. So this was purposely removed. Maybe the bayonet stud broke, I don't know, and the original cross pin, fixing pin, was put back in. So that's fairly easily explained. The other part that is a replacement, strangely enough, is the sling swivel. My first reaction, my first thought was this had broken. So this had been replaced by another one which happened to be lying around, and it has the number 02 on it. Nothing outlandishly unusual there. So, the next thing we look at, all of these rifles were made in different parts of Germany. Germany, when this was made, was not a completely unified country. There were separate princedoms or kingdoms, and these rifles were all made in arsenals in those different principalities. Now, this one was made in Spandau. Quite clearly says Spandau there. That is in Prussia. So that is the main arsenal for Prussia. On the side, even though it wasn't a unified country, they were still all under one king or one leader, and that was Frederick Wilhelm I, and there's his cipher and his crown. That's all fairly easy to understand. The other thing, which is always very useful, is the actual date of production, and they put that here on the rear end of the action on the receiver. So 1888. Now these were only made for about 9 years, because when they came out they were practically obsolete. The Germans hadn't kept up with the fact that this rifle is a black powder rifle, thumping grade bullet of about 11.15 millimeters, therefore a muzzle velocity of around about 400 foot per second. The French had developed smokeless powders in their rifles, and they had muzzle velocities of around 600 foot per second in the Lebel. So this rifle, when it came out, was practically obsolete. As is the way with German weapons and with lots of military weapons, everything is numbered. This butt plate carries the number 94. That is the last 2 numbers of the serial number, which is here, 9794. That is then repeated on this portion of the barrel. So these 2 parts, separate parts, this number is repeated, 9794. We also have the caliber, and the Germans, being very precise, have measured this one and put their 10.95 stamp on it. So 11mm, 10.95. So if we look over the rest of the rifle, I guarantee you there are 94s on everything apart from the parts that I have mentioned. The other marks that appear are inspection and acceptance marks, or ownership marks. These you find typical examples on the butt. These are cartouches that have been pressed into the timber. Frederick Wilhelm. There's another crown there, which I believe is the crown of Prussia. There are some on the underside of the stock, and then practically every screw, every component carries the same marks. So up to this point, everything's fine with this rifle. We're going along, everything's as per a standard infantry Gewehr. It's in beautiful condition, mechanically sound. Oh, while I was looking closely at it, I turned the rifle over and I found this. And this is what I initially thought it was a mounting point for a sling, possibly after service. A lot of these rifles got dished out privately after conflicts, or if they weren't wanted or used, and a very common thing was to whack a sling swivel in there and then move your sling mounting point down to here. So slightly irritated that that had happened to this rifle. When I then started looking at the markings on the butt plate, I was almost stopped in my tracks. What does 5JR mean? And then the rifle number, which is 219. Well, 219's easy enough. 5JR, J. To me, in German, the first thing that jumps to mind is Jager, or the Jager regiments. Now, what's so special about Jagers? Well, in brief, as collectors, one would happily get hold of an infantry rifle. Great, I've got the infantry rifle. Being a collector, what can I have next? What else is there in the Mauser 7184 cupboard? Well, more rare, more difficult to find, is a rifle known as the Jager Bush. Now, Jager literally means hunter. The Jagers were like scouts or superior infantry riflemen that moved ahead, skirmished, scouted. Basically, they were the elite. So everybody wants a Jager rifle. But this is not a Jager rifle. This is an infantry rifle. This is a big, heavy rifle. One of its main problems was, as the weight from the magazine altered, as the shots were altered, the centre of gravity altered. Soldiers had to learn to shoot with different weights in their magazine before they could be proficient with this weapon. So one would imagine that the Jagers wouldn't want it. But I did a little bit of research. I looked up Prussia. I looked up Jager. Prussia and Jager Jager units in Prussia. And what do you know? There was a Royal Prussian Jager battalion von Neumann, or the 1st Silesian, and the number attached to them was number 5. So, how do we know that this screw underneath the rifle butt wasn't just whacked in by any old hunter or private user? Well, lo and behold, the Jagers had their rear sling swivel at 190mm from the centre of this screw. If you measure these 2 points, it's exactly 190mm. That is uncanny. The fact that it hasn't been plugged with an unusual non-matching piece of timber, but it in fact has a screw in it, makes me think that this was an armoury alteration. So the life of the rifle was that the 5th Jager Battalion, Prussia, had to have these rifles for some reason. So being Jagers, they altered the sling swivel point to back here. When they had finished with the rifle, the sling was returned to the normal position and a blanking screw was put in. Obviously, during use and when issued, the markings were put on the butt. So what we have here is a very rare infantry rifle issued to a Jager battalion. The numbers match, the specifications match. So 7184 collectors, there's now another rifle you have to add to your collection, and it's a 7184 adapted for use by armourers for the Jagers. So I hope you enjoyed that. That's the sort of thing that gets me quite excited, because amongst the hundreds of thousands of these rifles produced, there will have only been a couple of thousand that ended up being specially issued to the Jagers. And this is one of them. So this is truly a rare rifle. That's why I like doing what I do. So remember to click like or subscribe, or if you want, join up with our membership and you'll get early videos and other benefits. I hope you've enjoyed that. See you again.